Yay! We're back. Here, let me just Greetings and welcome everybody to the Biblical Rose Gallery on Trinity Radio and When Deep Calls Deep. I'm Jonathan Bridget, and tonight I'm joined with Amber, of course, the boss, and Nick, the New Testament theologist. Some others said they might. I don't know. I don't care. I hope they do, but if they don't, we can manage because we always do. Tonight's a fun night. We're getting into Romans chapter 14, which is, I'm glad, Nick, you're with us because you are a pastor, and this gets into pastoral ministry stuff, like heavy. And the reason why, we had talked about doing all of chapter 14, but I realized with this week heavy on the judgy stuff, and then next week's going to mention wine and drinking. I figured that's going to be a whole derailment. We decided to split 14 into two parts. We'll do chapter 15 in 3 parts, and then we'll do 16 in 2 parts, which leaves after tonight 6 more episodes of the book of Romans, and then we'll have to think of what we're going to do next. Maybe we'll put a poll out on Trinity Radio. Anybody have any thoughts on the panel? What do you guys think? What's next?
Well, we need something that's going to get clicks outside of Romans 9. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if we do James, or actually we could do Jude. Nice short one. Nothing contested in Jude. Although Pritchett, I think we should do 1st and 2nd Peter. Throw you a bone.
Yeah, I'm for that. Amber, you want to stump for Leviticus? Just go straight through Leviticus.
I'm not sure that would be very popular on Trinity Radio. It goes over well on like my channel where people are Old Testament nerds, but I think it would be kind of fun to go through some Christian ethics and some controversial passages and kind of talk about those. That'd be kind of fun.
Yeah, I think Leviticus would be awesome. I think 1st and 2nd Chronicle, like I want to see, nobody would watch it, but they need to, because I know that like 1st Chronicles is nothing but names for a few chapters. Mm-hmm. We can make it awesome. Because there's
I would so be down for Chronicles. That's a book that a lot of people ignore. Dang, that would be fun. Yeah.
Every name is a story. Not every name, but a lot of those names are whole stories you have to go over.
Mm-hmm.
Why they're there. And
you could spend forever on that. But the thing that people don't realize is that one of the main themes of Chronicles is worship. So we'd be getting deep into the territory of what is worship by going into Chronicles. Mm-hmm.
But we still have 6 more weeks of Roman. I'm always for either James or 1st and 2nd Peter. I started a personal 1st Peter thing like 7 years ago. And never got.
Don't you have a book you're working on about Peter too?
No, I haven't worked on that in years, but it's still sitting on my hard drive here. I mean, I still have it.
Well, but those who care, this is nothing too intense. This is just my orange mead that I made.
Yeah. I think we're all like I know I'm okay with like drinking in moderation. So we're the bad Baptists here. I don't know what Amber's view is on that stuff, but I'm sure we'll find out next week. Don't tell anybody what you believe about it until we start talking about drinking wine.
Yeah, I won't tell anyone, Richard. Don't worry about it.
Down.
I learned it from you. That's an Arkansas thing.
That is not an Arkansas thing.
Yeah, that's Little Rock, Arkansas.
Yeah, if anyone is curious what I'm drinking during the show, Big K soda from. I don't even get this at Kroger though. We have a Rulers, which is a Kroger outlet. We don't even have a real Kroger here. They just sell
Kroger
stuff.
See, I know what's in this because I made it myself. You don't even know what's in that.
I don't care what's in this.
There's numbers in the ingredients list, Bridget.
Because I used to drink Diet Citrus Drop, which was the best soda on the planet, and then they stopped making it, and they started making zero sugar Citrus Drop, which doesn't taste the same. And so, boo, Kroger. But
hey, Pritchett, how are your chickens doing while we're here?
Right. Wow. Wait. More importantly, we have Alex joining us.
Alex,
yay!
We got another person, so we're not all like this on the screen.
Pastors are showing up with pastor stuff.
Hi, Alex. I'm Amber. I don't think we've gotten to be on Rogues Gallery together yet.
I don't think so. Good to meet you.
Religion pursuit of truth.
Say again?
Channel.
Oh, Relentless Pursuit of Purpose.
Purpose. Thank you. Sorry.
Yes.
Wrong
Yeah.
word. Relentless
But true.
Pursuit of Purpose. And wow. Sorry. It's Relentless Pursuit of Purpose, and y'all need to go subscribe to that right now.
I haven't done anything in a while. I've been so busy with FCA, but
Yeah, but
trying to
tonight you don't have any. There's no sporting practice that you have to be at.
that is true.
Wow.
Yep.
So what have you got going on lately then? Just speaking and preaching?
So I did actually speak at a conference this weekend out in Wheaton. It was one talk on apologetics, one on more of like evangelism through sport. And I haven't done much this year because I've been so busy with FCA. So just trying to, grow my footprint here for Fellowship of Christian Athletes.
Now, do you mean Wheaton College or Wheaton, Illinois?
Wheaton, Illinois. So it was it was at a church in Wheaton.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wheaton, Illinois.
So do you actually coach?
Chicagoland, for those who don't know, west of Chicago.
Yeah.
Do you actually coach any sports, or you just kind of?
No. I help coaches and athletes in this role, but I don't coach anything except for my girls in basketball when I can.
Oh, okay. So your wife is okay with you screaming at your girls on the, as dad coach?
So she's the screamer.
Oh, wow. Okay, there you go.
And that's mostly on the soccer field. I'm not. I mean, that's where they usually are. So
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, tonight we're going to be getting into Romans chapter 14, and that's going to be the weak and the strong. And there's going to be a lot of, there's a lot of theories of who is who in this passage. But first, we need to read it. So I'm going to go ahead and read tonight Romans chapter 14, 1 through 12. Now, accept the one who is weak in faith, but not to have quarrels over opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but the one who is weak eats only vegetables. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person values one day over another values every day the same. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and the one who eats does so with regard to the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And the one who does not eat, it is for the Lord that he does not eat, and he gives thanks to God. For not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord, or if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end, Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the living and the dead. But as for you, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or you as well, why do you regard your brother or sister with contempt? For we will all appear before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, to me every knee will bow, and every tongue will confess, or every tongue will give praise to God. So then each one of us will give an account of himself to God. All right, so opening this up, a few things that stuck out with me as I was reading the commentaries is who is the weak and the strong? So has anybody got any thoughts on that?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I heard it explained in this way, that not weak in the sense of physical. I think that's fairly agreed upon. But I think that the general go-to is like a lesser or immature Christian, which is one way. But I think it's also weak in certain areas. And so if somebody is former alcoholic, they could be strong Christian for years, but they're weak in that area, then they hopefully they can acknowledge they're weak in that area, and others can acknowledge that even though they're strong in that area, they don't want to hurt their brother or sister who's weak in that area. So
Yeah,
I think
that's going to be important for next week when we get into this idea of stumbling and being a stumbling block. That's going to come up. What are the? I mean, this is kind of a conversation that's been carried over from First Corinthians. So, but it seems to me that this issue is very important to Paul. And in the commentaries, they want to say, well, a lot of people divided on, well, the weak would be the Jewish congregations and the strong be the Gentile congregations. But that doesn't work for some other commentaries, because you also have the issue of some people don't eat meat. Certain Jews may not, because of access to kosher meat might be a barrier. But then again, there's an economic concern that a lot of people may not eat for aesthetic reasons from a pagan background or an economic background where they can't afford to eat meat, and so they don't. And then you've got with the issues of of every day the same. Some people say, well, that's about Sabbath, and there's Jews' Sabbath is Saturday, but the Lord's Day on Sunday, on the first day of the week coming from the resurrection. Some Gentiles might do that, but there's also pagan feasts and festivals that they still may observe too. And so I don't know that you can just neatly say Jewish Christians are the weak, which is what was like a popular idea, and then like Gentile Christians are the strong, because you probably have people who would fit this description within various house churches, both on the Gentile and the Jewish churches. But so this could, this doesn't cut as neatly as maybe people, if you factor in economics, you factor in certain aesthetic practices that certain Jews had in the diaspora, which would include Rome, and then certain aesthetic practices that a lot of people from pagan backgrounds would also have. So I don't think it cuts as neatly as we want to assume it does, or at least some of the commentaries want to assume it does, because a lot of other commentaries I've read are pushing back on this. Well, let's just divide it Jews and Greeks, because that's the issue. Nick, you read a lot more Roman stuff than I do. What do you think?
I think verse 2 is kind of illustrative of that point. Eats only vegetables. Boss can correct me, but vegetarianism was not prescribed theologically in the law. And so that already makes Jew or Gentile an issue, if you want to demarcate it. I don't think ethnicity is primary here, at least as kind of a major, Jew, Gentile, or let me qualify, pagan Jew specifically. I don't think that's in mind, but that doesn't mean, I should clarify, I don't think that's primarily in mind. If it's there, it's subsidiary, it's secondary at best. Weak in faith is interesting, and there may be an additional element to this that we didn't mention, is weak can also refer to sick or unhealthy. And specifically, it's used in the Gospels specifically to refer to heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. And so there's a physiological component to this as well. And weakness, at least in Paul, and give me a second, I'm filling errors as I do this, but John will use the language of Lazarus being ill, same word. But specifically in Romans, the most relevant portion is probably Romans 8:3, for what God has done with the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. So weakened in terms of power, but that's not entirely coordinate, but you would say something along the lines of there's a physiological component that Paul seems to tie to this word group. And that actually fits with the Jesus tradition very strongly. So which actually may suggest two things. One, Paul has Jesus ringing in his ear when he's dealing with this. And two, we have to deal with the notion of Old Testament purity being applied to pagans. So it's not just about apostle having the freedom to do as you want to do, but we now have to deal with the issue of if it's a person who's weak in faith in terms of power or subjection or something like that, that's different than the person whose faith is sick or impoverished even, or unhealthy, not in a moral sense per se, but there is that component. And that actually fits very nicely with, say, 1 John and other epistles, where the Christians, we often assume people will say baby Christian. And it's like, well, they're not baby Christians, but you can have an immature or unwise Christian. And I'm using Christian as a catch-all term, so forgive me on that. But I think the language of contempt in verse 3, or despise, depending on how you render that, does seem to suggest there is a sort of identitarianism at play, but also the notion of sickness, a la, say, like 1 Corinthians 8-11, where idolatry and meat sacrifice to idols and food in that sense might actually be an additional command. So just to wrap up, you've got potential, again, and I'm not arguing assurance, but potential idolatry and economics tied up in that, and the food. You have the nature of sickness, so you might say the person who is sick in faith, or has faith, but it's a sick faith, not in a morally sense, but in a, weakened, oppressed state. And also, and that actually is compounded by the welcoming language or acceptance language, proslambano, right? To welcome in, that's a cultural or social cultural term. So you take those two things together, I think we're not talking pagan versus Jew, but I don't think Paul has had that directly in mind. Paul's trying to argue about what the expectations are and about purity. And he makes purity more than about pagan or Jew. It's far more interesting than that. And I realize I've said a lot, so I apologize, but those are things I have kind of.
The weak in faith is obviously an epitaph that's probably used by those that consider themselves the powerful, strong ones. But
Bridget, wouldn't we just say like James 2? The rich lord it over others, the rich sit at the table, and the rich do this, and there's no money for folks.
Epictetus and Horace both use that term for weak in a not in a deficiency kind of way, not necessarily like
deficiency morally or deficiency physically, because those are two different things.
Not physically. I mean, they would be using. I mean, it does mean like in a literal sense physical, but using it weak in faith is trying to apply a deficiency or substandard pairing to their faith, like their faith is metaphorically sick, like it's deficient. And so Paul seems to want to use this epitaph, weak in faith, not because he agrees with it, but because he wants to address those who are using this term themselves of their opponents. And what's interesting is that Lakana, that's translated vegetables, it's really more of just like leafy green garden stuff, which is not, I mean, like if even in Mediterranean first century non-meat eaters, they still, I mean, that doesn't prohibit grains or fruits or anything else.
Yeah, we're not talking about white people who live in LA who
we're not talking about like modern day vegans. So what's interesting is when in verse 2, well, let's go ahead and get into that, because in verse 2,
and while you guys are talking about that real quick, I think it further highlights, Paul's not shy ever about calling out Gentiles. He's never shy about even calling out Jews. And so I think it is more broad here because he's not specifically doing that. He did that in, every chapter before this pretty much. And so now he's laid his case and he's saying, okay, so now that you guys understand the framework and the foundation for our faith, this is how we get along. This is how we're supposed to act towards one another.
Yeah, because I think he's already done the theological heavy lifting to unite Jewish and Gentile churches. And now I think the focus is more internally into certain problems that are within various households. And so I don't think you can say, these Gentile churches just simply think that, no, because you're going to have these kind of people in every church. Some you think have, and I think that's borne out. I hate to get all Wesleyan, but that's borne out by those of us who bring in personal experience along with tradition and reason, in addition to scripture, that in our experience, we have this kind of stuff in churches. Amber, you wanted to say something real quick?
Yeah, I think we need to back up a little bit and just talk about the context of sacrifice in the ancient Near East first, before we get too far into this, to understand what it is, the background of what we're dealing with here. So a lot of people, when they come into this, you've got, if they understand it or are familiar with the Old Testament at all, we're thinking about it in the Judaic context, which is very different from the rest of the ancient Near East. Most of the rest of the ancient Near East is using these sacrifices as a way to try to beg favor from their deities. And so they are offering these to try to get favor, to earn a cessation of chaos, basically. So they're offering multiple sacrifices to multiple gods, creating these deals, trying to obligate the god's favor to them by offering these things, and that is a gateway to the opposite of holiness that we see. It's the so it is in that context, in that way, we can look at that as gateways to the demonic. So that's what is happening with these pagan sacrifices. They are trying to fill themselves, and with idols that are on these altars and things. They are like statues, but have openings so that that spirit of that deity can come and stay there and give them that favor that they're trying to beg and obligate. So there's a lot of demonic darkness that are involved with this sacrificial process, which God takes and pulls it out of that context and uses it to cleanse and claim holy space. So the sacrifices that are happening in Leviticus, in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, that is reclaiming and claiming sacred space. Those are cleansing, those are healing, those are resets. Every time you go in for a sacrifice, you're reset, which is the opposite of the pagan world.
Yeah, and that's going to tie into the meat too in a city like
Right.
Rome, because a lot of the market meat is stuff that was previously probably used in some sort of pagan ceremony, just as it would be in Corinth. And of course, Paul next week gets into that's another big issue about the not just ancient Jewish world in the ancient Near East, but just in the ancient Mediterranean by the first century. Everyone had their purity maps, as we'll call them, of what was clean and unclean, ceremonially or otherwise. And so that language comes up next. That's going to be next week. Going to have to focus heavily on that, because food is tied to that. It's not just because we want to think of, well, in the Old Testament, we know certain animals were viewed as off limits or whatever for unclean. It had nothing really to do with health issues. It had to do with boundary issues more than anything. But those maps are going to be different depending on if you have a Jewish background or a pagan background. And even within paganism, it's not like everyone had the same ideas about various temple cults and various gods that the pagans, even in a cosmopolitan city like Rome, you're going to have a bunch of different people ascribing to different kind of gods for different kind of reasons that you mentioned. They're making appeals for, less chaos and more what we, grace or benefaction or, a better harvest or whatever. So a lot of this stuff, right. But I mean, even in a modern context, even in our context, some people, I mean, you can transfer this out of the realm of food, because Paul's going to bring the whole death and resurrection, not of yourselves, kind of broadens the issue that he's focusing in on food here. Because what's interesting that I found in looking at this is Paul's opening salvo, his thesis was, accept the person who's weak in faith and don't quarrel over your opinions about these matters. And that's kind of like already broadening it out besides what he hones in on. And in verse 2, he exaggerates. I mean, this is a book that's talked about faith as the ground of justification for Jew and Gentile alike. And now he's bringing in faith, tying it to the faith to eat and the faith to not eat, and judging and contempt, a lot of honor language. But he exaggerates this idea of faith, and the eating of the strong and weak. Strong is all things. He doesn't even just say certain animals. He says, I mean, literally all things, which is kind of an overstatement of what the kind of meat that they probably eat. Because he's saying anything edible. I mean, it's all things. And then when he talks about the weak, that lakana is just basically just leafy vegetables, has nothing to do with grains, fruits, or whatever. And so it seems like, I think Paul's using these terms that exaggerates eat anything, just literally, I mean, maybe not people, but just basically, anything edible. And then there's other people that are only eating out of the garden or whatever. And so I think Paul's strategy here is he's exaggerating the issue between the weak and the strong, so that he's not singling out anybody in particular, but he can make his general principle wherever you are on that spectrum between eating only something out of your backyard garden that's got green on it, or eating literally anything, including rodents or whatever else that you can find, get your mouth on and cook over a fire.
Yeah.
So I think he's blowing these two terms, about meat and vegetables. I mean, he starts off in verse 2, kind of sets the stage of not really applying to everyone who can fall within a spectrum, as opposed to like literally describing there's one group of people that will shove anything in their mouth that they want, and then other people that will only eat particular green things. So
Well, I think outside of our context, this doesn't make as much sense. So, like, I have a brother who's Haitian, who is adopted, and we've been to Haiti before. And there, when you're dealing with voodoo, and you go to the market and you're going to go buy chicken, there you have to keep track of who's selling meat that was used in a voodoo ritual and who wasn't, because there is an element of demonic residue left in meat that was sacrificed in a voodoo ritual. So this is very much an actual problem for them. Like, is this food going to be tainted or not? There's a story in, I can't remember, somewhere in church history, where it comes with now they have this during Lent, they use this grain stuff that they eat, and it's a story from this period of time just after the New Testament was written, where a marketplace, someone took and tainted all of the food with blood that was sacrificed to a different god. And because they were trying to taint the Christians by making them eat this animal, sacrificed blood on the food that they were eating. And so somebody who has become a saint in the tradition now had a vision which stalls had clean food and which ones didn't. And so they were able to, by living off this this wheat stuff. I can't remember. I just read it the other day too. It's terrible. But so, there's a very much an issue of this issue being tainting your holiness. So it matters what you put in, what you ingest yourself, whether it's food or whatever. We'll get into that later. But this is a big problem, more than just Jew Gentile. This has to do with your holiness and them understanding as a vessel of God, containing the image of God and containing, the Holy Spirit. It matters what you ingest. You don't want to be bringing in all kinds of demonic whatnots into your cleansed temple.
Sure, as long as unless you're someone who thinks, well, that's not real. We know that there's only but one God. I mean, Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians. He addresses that issue. We know that those idols aren't a thing in the world and all of that, and some people can eat. And, but I think here, I like the pastoral approach, because it seems like someone who can, we gloss over the all things, but I mean, literally, Paul's tone here is that you have this faith that you can just eat whatever versus just eat leafy things. And I think what it does is it kind of encapsulates this entire spectrum, so that wherever you fall on it, you can actually relate to this. Mm-hmm. Because some people may fall into that category. Well, they'll eat meat, but if some meat's been used in some sort of voodoo religion and stuff, somebody may abstain from that one, even if they're not abstaining from meat in general. And then other people just abstain from meat altogether. Maybe it's for aesthetic reasons, maybe it's for financial reasons or whatever. So there's I think what Paul's doing, and I have to tip my hat to Jewett for pointing this out and calling out a lot of the other commentators, is no, this is not something you can easily divide, because you're going to find people all over the spectrum. And Paul puts like as far of a contrast so that no one person will fit these categories anymore, so that he can say, look, it reinforces his audience that y'all are all somewhere between this, and therefore all of this applies to every one of you. His lessons about don't hold your brother in contempt and don't judge your brother for that, because he's not singling out anyone in particular, but he's calling them all out together. And I think that's actually a pretty smart strategy.
Yeah. And I think that, if there was an overarching message from this chapter or these next couple chapters, is we have to agree on the core tenets. Those are the things where we'll break fellowship, but not over personal convictions. And where it would apply today, I heard somebody I was teaching with, and she said whenever she plays cards, she turns into a different person. Like she don't curse at all, but she does when she's in that realm. And so for different people, your thing is your thing, and that's where you become less of a Christian individual. And knowing where your weaknesses lie, I think, like you said, we all have some areas of weakness, whether it's the food, and he'll get into the days and the seasons. And it's like, if you want to celebrate this festival, go ahead. Just understand that that's not mandatory or compulsory in our faith now. And so, like you said, he's covering that wide range because everybody's going to have their personal conviction on what's good and what's not. And I think for the weak person, last thing I'll say is, I think that's the other danger is they're weak in understanding. So when it says weak in faith, so if somebody is a new Christian, they're like, I'm a Christian now, I'm not doing XYZ and I'm hardcore on it. And then they're looking at you who's been a Christian for 20 years and you're like, yeah, it's okay. And so it's a lack of understanding possibly, but also we don't want that to be a reason for that new or weak Christian to almost break fellowship with a stronger one.
Yeah, and that's one thing I want to get to, the difference between someone who's weak in their faith, like you described, and then what I've heard referred to as the weaker brother syndrome, where they make it a point to stay weak so that they can judge everyone else who has liberty. So yeah, we'll get into that. But as pastors, y'all typically adopt this kind of strategy. I've heard a lot of pastors, when they want to address an issue but not single anyone out in particular because they know it's wider than just one person, and they've all had that one person say, you were preaching and you were talking, I was in your office a week ago and you were preaching to me about it. You're like, no. So I know one strategy is to cast extremes so that everyone else will find a way in there.
Yeah,
that's a pretty good strategy so that you don't so you can convict everybody without having to have that conversation. You're talking about me and I confided in you and you didn't say my name, but you were, sometimes I say, Pastor, that sermon was straight to my heart in a good way. And sometimes they say, you were talking about me to the whole church, even without using my name. That was about me in a bad way. So it could go either way. Yeah.
And as you're saying about pastorally, we've seen clips and heard stories of the pastor that's going to stand up in the pulpit, and it probably is one person in their mind and that they're talking about LGBT or whatever. Rather than do that, why not just say all sexual sin, and you include fornication and all that in there? And so therefore you're addressing the real heart of the issue, but it's not just a singling somebody out issue.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I've noticed with that is the text. What is there like? I think they call it 6 clobber verses with that particular LGBT. So the weight of the scripture is against just like heteronormative sexual impropriety. And you're gonna cast a wide net with that anyway. But if you don't actually include the LGBTQ stuff into that as well, you actually won't mention it unless you're in a particular text at all. So there's people run the danger of that's all they ever talk about, or they never ever talk about it. And I've seen very good churches fall into, like, I would say that my church that I attend, sadly avoids sex a lot. Talking about I know that our youth group hears it a lot, but there's probably more fornicators.
I don't know. Have you ever been in an old person's home, Pritchett? They get
the seniors are the worst. I've heard all about those stories too. Yeah. Paul's argument, though, in verse 3, the one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does, or the one who eats. Is there anything we need to know about contempt versus judge? Do we make anything of that in verse 3, Nick? Because I mean, those are his 2 words that he comes back to. So the one who eats is not to hold the person in contempt who doesn't, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who does. because God has accepted him. You know, what is there anything? I mean, could the judge go both ways and the contempt go both ways, and this is a stylistic choice, or is there something about the strong Christian having contempt for the weak ones versus is that just a normal tendency that we have that the we lost Amber. Is it that is that like a normal tendency where the stronger believers will hold in contempt the weaker ones, and then the weaker ones will typically be the ones who are judgmental towards, or is this could either go both ways?
I mean, if you're telling me I can't have steak because you got a problem, you might catch a word or two, or at least a little side eye.
Some contempt there, yeah.
But I mean, despise or hold in contempt or ridicule. There is a sort of idea of to maybe ethically disregard, and so you're kind of shunting or shunning them, diminutizing them, dehumanizing them. And do not judge is probably a little more different. It'd be something more along the lines of overtly condemn, so to speak. So there is this sense of kind of, if you want to gloss it, don't roll your eyes at them, and don't spit in their food.
Well, I actually think you could be judgmental towards the weaker ones as well, but I do think that he's onto something here, because I think, having been a Christian for 31 years now, I sense that I'm more likely to have contempt for weaker Christians than I am going to be necessarily judgmental. Especially when
I've seen you eye roll me. Just
no, I'm just saying. I think that that's probably the natural tendency, which is why he said don't regard those with contempt, because, like, I want to just make a distinction between the weaker brother or sister and then like the weaker brother syndrome person, because those are two different people. Like, someone who is new to the faith might seriously have a problem with certain practices that more mature Christians don't see a problem with. But I think also there's a sense, the fact that he's putting this on a spectrum. I don't think if you get to where is it? There's a later verse. He broadens this out. Where is that? Maybe it's in the next.
Yeah, verse 13.
Yeah, because it seems like you can be weak on one thing and strong on another. So it seems like if we weren't talking about food here, like in this passage, I might be strong in the fact that I think it's okay to have a drink in moderation or whatever. But I also look at Braxton funny when he tells me certain things that he watches on streaming services that my wife and I don't watch. And I don't really judge, but I do kind of
get a little
watch that. Maybe
get that Clint Eastwood.
Maybe unless you subscribe to that service that screens out a lot of stuff, I mean, I think we all can find something that we can slide into judgmental mode that we might be weaker on. But at some point, something's got to be sin. It's like, I mean, you can't have, I'm such a strong Christian that I can handle porn and just appreciate the beauty, or give me a break. I mean, that's going a little far. But then again, certain things on HBO Max, I think, borderline on just, artistic porn. I don't know, but it's like, I think you can find things that you can be strong on some things, but you might be weaker on others. So I don't think this issue, food is the example that he's bringing into this text because it's probably an issue in Rome, but he does broaden it out to whatever, any of these kind of things about what we have to give an account for and what we find acceptable. Don't be judged for what you find, what you can do in good conscience versus what you judge others. So I don't know. It's Dude McMahon says, I judge anybody who watches Twilight movie. Yeah, I mean, but that's more of a. I mean,
He's
yeah.
judging you, Pritchett. He's calling you.
No, I don't. I don't watch it. My wife does though, and she has. We have those books. My wife and I guess it was what was it? Late 30s, early 40s when those books were popular. Sorry, honey, for giving away your age. She turned 50 this year. I'm 48, still younger. No, but she went through that phase that a lot of adult women go through where they love young adult books, even though they're over 30.
You want a shovel, Pritchett? Keep digging. This is really funny. Someone's going to clip this and send this to your wife.
No, man. I mean, and so I could be a little bit judgy, but it's just interesting that I think that if you take this away from just food, that issue, that I could see that a lot of people could be strong on some issues.
I think also what's beneath the surface here, maybe not so much from based on what chapter 12 is, this is going to sound cheesy, but we're stronger together. And so when we talk about the body of Christ, if there is an area, for example, Jonathan, that you're stronger than me, rather than judge me, help me get stronger in that area, and vice versa. And we can never do that if we're busy judging each other based on our own personal convictions on any issue. So it's not to say I'm right, you're right, or who's right, but if I am wrong, rather than judge, the way to help me get to be right is by lovingly pointing those things out where I can be led to grow through you and through the Holy Spirit, so that I can become stronger in those areas.
Yeah, I like that approach. The only problem I have with it is not really my problem, but there's a debate raging in both Romans commentaries and First Corinthians commentaries about who does Paul really side with? Is it the liberty side, the strong side, or is it the weak side? Because you've got don't let those people give you hassle for what you could do in good conscience versus don't cause someone to stumble. Right. And that's where I think the book of Proverbs has to bail us all out. That's a wisdom issue. Like, okay, because Nick, before he bolted, was talking about this idea of accepting him or welcoming him into the group. But if I'm around like a judgmental teetotaler, but all of my friends are wanting to go, smoke a cigar and maybe have a little sip of whiskey with it. Not that we do that like every day, but I'm saying, I don't have a problem with that kind of thing.
Yep.
Well, maybe I don't want to be like, you can't be around us, but at the same time, we don't want you around if all you're going to do is gripe at us for something that like we do once a month. It's like, this is like, we don't have a problem with it. No one has issues with alcohol. Now I get it. It's different. Like someone who struggled with alcohol, but the weaker brother syndrome is not a former alcoholic. He's a person who thinks that Jesus drank grape juice, and that doesn't. And so, there's a lot of issues of how do you be welcoming and gracious and also intentionally excluding people because, hey, look, if you're just going to continue to judge me for what I find, it's okay that if I sip on whiskey and smoke a cigar and you have a big problem with it and you think that I can't have anything, then, well, for usually those people are okay. They probably smoke cigarettes, which is worse than cigars, but
yeah.
Or at least they don't care that their deacons smoke, those kind of pastors. So, I mean, it's like there's a whole lot to navigate here that Paul doesn't really, so it's what side does Paul really land on? Because he sounds pro-liberty, but he's also, don't you be a stumbling block in both Romans and First Corinthians. So you're a pastor. How do you sort that out?
Yeah, I think this is where the stronger can get in trouble too, because we can sometimes take our liberty too far and it is a problem. And then we're not willing to be called out on that. So, and then even when we are, it's probably being called out on the entire issue, not just on an instance or on going too far. So
hey, you don't need to re-pour that glass kind of thing versus, that might not be as big of a deal as, hey, you're doing this every day and you're drinking pretty heavy.
Right.
And then that's where you take the liberty too far. And that guy has a point to call you out.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's where you have to have just a lot of wisdom and discernment of, and accountability, I guess is important.
That's a huge one. Probably the biggest.
Yeah. Well, some accountability partners are better than others too, I've learned.
That's true.
So, verse 3 with the contempt and judging, I mean, it seems like that's pretty straightforward. In verse 4, he says, who are you to, he asks us back to the diatribe thing, who are you to judge the servant of another? Well, ketin is not doulos, so he's avoiding economic language here, which I think is interesting, using a more generic of menial servant as opposed to like the doulos slave kind of language here. I think that that's probably intentional because I think there's a lot of economic factors, because a lot of them would either be recently freed slaves or household slaves in these congregations, and that would apply to all of them. So he's avoiding that language, but he's kind of reducing everybody, because the who are you to judge, that seems to be echoing the language that would fit more the one who does not eat. So that would be like more towards the weaker brother, I think. To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand. For the Lord is able to make him stand. So it's kind of, I guess it could be more broad if you use contempt and judge as interchangeable, but I don't know that. Or this could be pointed, who are you to judge, you weaker in faith people? It's kind of, I don't know. It's it's one of those things about Paul that I never know how to go, because he's hard to understand.
Yeah, and I think, but maybe that's partially intentional to your earlier point that, you know, there's plenty of times where Paul's very clear. You know, do not do this, do this. Right. So this kind of vague, you know, line that he's drawn, I think is possibly intentional, just so that people don't pick their box and you know, kick everybody else who's not in it.
Well, that's true. That's why it's a spectrum, obviously, here, because he used two extremes. So wherever I guess anyone could be weak and strong, depending on the issue, because food's not the only issue that's probably dividing these churches. But he's like, you know, it's weird because when it comes to sexual sin in 1 Corinthians, Paul thinks that, well, you don't judge outsiders, but you should judge each other all day long. But here he's like, who are you to judge? I don't know how to square that one. I guess it's on the adiaphora matters, because I guess sexual sin is not like matters of indifference for believers, whereas eating and drinking and holy days and all that, which we'll get to, because he brings that in. So he opens that up even a little bit more. So I guess this issue is don't judge on matters of indifference.
Yeah. And maybe this, I don't know if this helps, but the word judge is a couple verses above is krino. Yeah. And in the lexicon, it says to pronounce an opinion concerning right or wrong. So this is almost, you're the judge, jury, not necessarily executioner, but you've determined this ruling is final on this person and what they're doing based on what you say. And I think he's obviously wanting us to stop short of making that kind of declaration.
Well, yeah, because he's going to go on. This section's closed out by giving your account to God, because we're all going to be judged by God. You know, the judgment seat of God is the one that matters. And so kind of hinting at that early on in verse 4 is like, well, the Lord is able to make him stand, because that no matter where you are on a socioeconomic scale, at least in the Greco-Roman world, if the Lord is the ultimate master, no matter where you are in the household, you know, so that's the one who's going to hold him up. And so if God has accepted him, verse 3, then who are you to pass matters on these? And I guess the hard part for the probably then as now is what matters are matters of indifferent and what aren't, whether it's food, drink, theological perspectives on eschatology or soteriology or whatever. I mean, where do you know,
politics?
Huh?
Politics.
Oh yeah, politics. In the church. You got to vote for around for going to hell. I had that fight with this channel with my good friend Tim about that. You can go watch that episode. We had a lot of fun. He's my homie, but we didn't agree on that. We went at it for about an hour and a half. But yeah, it's like there's all of these issues, and you got to find out what's central, what's not, because in one sense, we're not to judge one another on those things, but in another sense, on those clear things, clearly Paul in 1 Corinthians tells us to judge, not outsiders, but those within the church. You know, stemming from a sexual issue with a guy and his father's wife and all of that is like, even the pagans think that that's too far. So, I mean, it's a challenge, I think. And I think it's one that we haven't, not we as a, but I think we Christians in general, especially in America, have not thought. I mean, look at Christian Twitter. It's a cesspool of hate, and, infighting and all that.
Yeah.
And so it's like, we haven't thought these things. Like the theology nerds will say, well, I mean, Trinity, Nicene Creed, Apostles' Creed, all that. But then other people will go, no, all that. I mean, some people make the age of the earth like, if you're a old earth creationist, or even someone like me who doesn't even care, it's like, no, you have to be literal 6 day, 10 to 50,000 years, or you're not a Christian. I mean, just Calvinists sometimes think non-Calvinists are just heretics consigned to the flames. And where do you draw those lines?
Yeah, I think we have to have a good understanding of the core tenets, the things that are non-negotiable. Like if somebody says to me, I'm a Christian, but I don't believe in the deity of Christ, then I'm sorry, you're just not, you're not in the club, so to speak. But the things that are outside of that, especially things that are not leading to or leading others to sin, they can be secondary, tertiary type issues, or maybe not even issues at all, just personal opinions, personal convictions. But I think, like you said earlier, it takes wisdom to know the difference between what those things might be. I mean, I think the things we can easily identify is like deity of Christ, what do you believe about the Trinity and those types of things, salvation, not in terms of when but just that we will be saved, that he's coming back, all those types of things. But outside of that, there is a lot of gray area. And I think for me, when I walk with, quote unquote, weaker brothers or sisters, it's not a judgment per se for me. It's more of a recognition, like, okay, this is where they are. That's where they are. It doesn't mean I agree with it. It doesn't mean I condone it. It just means I know that's the starting point from which I and they can grow. And I think if we approach it like that at the outset, we'll have less judging. And I think that other part you mentioned is important, that we're going to be judged ourselves. So, it doesn't mean we don't judge. It just means we should be more cautious.
Yeah, and how we judge, and cautious of how we like. So Paul's strategy, I think your strategy sounds like, when you talk about walking alongside the weaker, Paul's that I'm going to be all things to all people. So there's certain things I'm not going to do around certain people because you know where they are at. That you may or may not. I mean, you don't have to give me your personal you don't have to tell anybody what you extent of your liberty. I feel weird telling people I have an occasional glass of whiskey and cigars, but somebody's got to bite the bullet here, and nobody watches this anyway. But I mean, it's like, I do have a couple of little things that I know some people would disapprove of.
Yeah.
And so I throw those out there, but I usually, I've always on this channel have told the liberty, the liberty freaks is like, you don't have to just flaunt it. Like I really don't like the craft brew folks who sit there and every podcast, that's what they talk about. I'm like, yeah, in the beer and Bible study thing, I don't have a problem with it, but let's not just like throw that out there and it's like, when you flaunt your liberty, I think you shut down your opportunities to be a good influence to people. So I like to keep my liberty at the house for the most part.
Me too.
That's kind of my, and what the extent of that is between me, God, and whoever is in my circle of accountability, and so I don't advertise like all the things I do. I advertise my judgments, like what Braxton watches on streaming, but I'm happy to be the weaker brother on that stuff, and some of the video games that they play, and but I'm probably just being an old grump more than anything. But I like that approach, because that's the maturity of Paul. The all things to all people. I'm going to walk alongside them, which, I mean, God bless you if you can. I mean, I think the pastor has to, though.
Yeah.
Because that's the point of this. That's why I think you can't draw this with, well, these congregations are the strong ones, because in any congregation you're going to have this spectrum.
Yeah.
And as a pastor, you have to shepherd all of them. You can't pick favorites.
I totally agree. And obviously, so when I was youth pastoring, there's certain things I won't do, obviously, in front of them. Now, if they ask me a question, I'll answer honestly, but yeah, like you said, I'm not going to put it on Front Street necessarily, because it's not helpful and it's not necessary. And I agree with you on the over flaunting of some things that, we have some liberty to do, but I don't know if that's what we want to lead with, is our liberty.
Yeah, that's the and I get why people lead with it, because I think that they're going to appeal to a certain demographic that maybe other people can't appeal to. Mm-hmm. But I think even that becomes the license to sin. Mm-hmm. And I'm not trying to, here I am being judgmental again, but I have seen that.
Yeah.
I've seen that in my own life. I've seen where I have let my liberty lead me to sin. And some people have to say, look, I've been a Christian for 30 years. I not a perfect,
Same here. I've had, I think the wisdom and the discernment to know, okay, this is the group of people I'm with. And I pray that prayer almost every day. Help me become all things to all people. Cause I talk to so many different types of, or groups of people, from non-believers to youth, to adults, to wherever. And you got to know who you're with when you're with them, and understand what could be stumbling blocks to this group is not necessary to that group, for a variety of reasons. And I think that's the call to the strong believer. It's more responsibility on them to know those things and to know how to enter into any and every situation or any conversation. A weaker brother is not going to say necessarily, or a newer Christian, I should say, is not going to necessarily know that up front. And, which is also a good reason, as you said, that they should not judge, because they don't have the full understanding of what is a liberty, what's not, and how far should those things go. But a stronger brother should. And to that point, and agreeing with you, the, beer and Bible types of things. Yeah, you're strong, but the people who are watching you are not all strong.
Yeah. Or their weakness in the faith is not just a judgmental weakness, but it's a deficiency, like somebody who had a struggle with alcohol, and you putting it in their face could easily cause them to stumble, which is, Jesus warns a whole lot about stumbling, because next week we're going to get into our next time we meet. Hopefully it'll be 2 weeks in a row, but there's a lot of Jesus tradition in the back half of this chapter that you can make ties to that I think are really, really important. So next week or next episode would be a lot more fun than this one. But yeah, I mean, the goal to be all things to all people, that requires a lot of wisdom, and that requires a lot of patience. And I think part of the problem with a lot of Christians is they can be cliquish even within a local congregation, and they don't have the patience to walk alongside certain people that can benefit from their company, even if it means putting away your liberty for a while.
Yeah, that's good.
So days, one person judges, or it is actually technically judges, but literally judges, but the NASB says values one day over another values every day the same. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. Here again is the temptation with our familiarity with just the Old Testament, New Testament is, oh, well, that's clearly got to be the Sabbath versus non-Sabbath. So that's clearly got to be the Jew-Gentile thing. But in the ancient Greco-Roman world, pagans had feast days, luck days, astrology days, carnival days, all kinds of festive days as well. And of course, the Jews had a lot of their holy day calendars. So there's no way Paul doesn't doesn't even suggest Sabbath here. So he could be talking about anything. A lot of Gentiles, even now, I know a lot of, like, my old Baptist church back in Arkansas celebrated a Passover meal just to learn about the Old Testament Passover, the whole story in Exodus. So it's like they weren't attaching Judaizer type ideas to it, but they're like, this is a cool thing that Jews have been doing for thousands of years. Let's check it out. And so some people may get too far into that stuff and become a Judaizer, but maybe not necessarily. So there's all kinds of Gentiles could just around Jewish people decide we're going to follow some of this calendar stuff, even in Rome, even without Judaizing. So there's no clear way here. And in fact, I think it's possible, some people try to argue that Paul kept kosher forever. I don't know that that's true if he ate with Gentiles. I actually would, if he becomes all things to all people, I think that means he might not have ate kosher all the time. I don't know for sure, but the arguments have not persuaded me that he just remained kosher.
Right. I agree with you. And I think even when he calls out Peter in Galatians 2, at the dinner table, basically, there was, different types of food there, I'm guessing. Where he got up from the Jew table to go to the Gentile table or vice versa. I think you're right. I think we don't know for sure, obviously, but I think Paul had more wisdom in that area, depending on who he's with, even where we see sometimes where he says we don't need to do these Jewish rituals or customs, but then was it in Acts 21 or even with Timothy, he's like, go do this, shave your head.
Get circumcised.
So, right.
All right, Timothy, we're getting out the night. Well, that's conversation. And James dragged Paul to the temple and he was sacrificing animals.
Right.
Started a riot anyway. I mean, it didn't help, but it was like Paul does literally try to be all things. But I mean, food was such the feast, even the church eating together was such a big deal. Like we think communion is our cracker and the wine, but I mean, they really did it up, it was a love feast. And that was a big deal. And the reason why I don't think Paul kept kosher is if eating is a central thing and he tries to be all things to all people, what other way besides food could that have been referring to? Because they didn't do much else.
Right.
It's not like, we're going to still go to the pagan temple. They weren't doing. So what else could it have been?
Right.
That he was like the Gentiles to be with the Gentiles if eating was not like the main thing. So I think that Paul was probably not following kosher because food seems to be something he comes back to. It was what he griped at Peter at Antioch about, that mentioned in Galatians 2. And there's no other. What else? I mean, not temple prostitution, because he said you can't do that anymore. Right. So what else was he doing besides table worship?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So I've never heard a convincing argument that he became like them in what other respect? I wouldn't know if food wasn't the main thing.
Right. Without sacrificing any theology, I think that could be the only thing left.
Yeah. So, I mean, and he's got this both here and in 1 Corinthians, he's got that attitude of, it's almost as if he doesn't want to deal with this, at least with the eating stuff.
Yeah.
And then with the holy days he's like, he sets up this argument. He's like, the one who observes the day, he observes it to the Lord. Great. The one who eats, he does it with regard to the Lord, and he gives thanks, which is like a prayer of thanksgiving for the food. And the one who does not eat, he does that for the Lord, and he does not eat. Well, great. He gives thanks to God for not eating, let it be. I mean, it sounds like everyone's doing this stuff for the Lord because God has accepted both the weak and the strong. You care about this day, you don't care about that day. And between this and Colossians and I don't know how they argue from Paul about the Seventh-day Adventists and things like that. Like Paul seems to be almost bothered he has to mention this stuff.
Yeah.
To say that he's commanding or that, well, he means everything but the first for the 10 Commandments or whatever.
Yeah. Same thing with they got a lot of issues. But Hebrew Israelites, it's big on keeping certain feasts and festivals and certain things that really don't apply to us anymore. But that's what they're making that's what they're camping out on. One of many incorrect issues that they camp out on. But yeah.
So I know people who have not read a lot of church history, like very early. We know some Jews still kept the Jewish Sabbath Saturdays, or sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. We know that a lot of Gentile Christians are meeting on the first day of the week, which would have been Sunday, which is why we carry that tradition today, unless you're like Messianic Jews. They don't. But I know a lot of other Christians who are not even Messianic Jews that think that we should do a Sabbath simply because of that. But I don't know how you get through what Paul's saying about, I think that's weak and strong, because I'm like, I actually don't have contempt for people who want a Saturday. I don't care, right? But I know that they have a very judgmental attitude towards me for on Sunday.
That's a good point. So
that's an issue that remains today. This verse 6 about who observes the day. It doesn't matter what day it is. Paul's still being very generic. It's kind of the same strategy of opposite extremes here when it comes to various days. He's being so generic, it could apply to anything. And I think that's intentional on Paul's part, because he's calling out everyone who either cares too much, or wants to judge those who care too much. And it's like, no, it doesn't. This is more adiaphora. It doesn't matter. Amber, you're quiet.
Yeah, well, I think a couple things. One, I think Paul cares about two things primarily in the bulk of his writing. And the first thing is the gospel, the integrity and the preserving the message of the gospel. And the second thing is unity. And so I think this chapter is playing out that balance between protecting the gospel, even over unity and the things that matter, and just grace in the stuff that doesn't. Don't shove your brother off a cliff because you think you're better. We got to preserve the unity that is the example of the gospel. That's the thing that he came to do in the first place. And so I think Paul is like, this is swatting flies because y'all are forgetting the gospel and the unity is the thing that matter.
That's good.
Sorry, I was muted. Section 12 starts all about the unity thing, right? That's his primary, because I mean he's trying to get these churches all together, and it seemed to have a lot of problems. I mean, one of the things that people often forget when you're dealing with Romans is that Paul is still writing an occasional letter, right? There's really things going. It's not a systematic theology that's just generic and it just happened to be to Rome. I mean, there's really things in Rome that all of this stuff, not just the chapters 12 and following, but like the first 11 matter to Rome too. And I think, oh, go ahead.
I think too that he knows these letters are going to get circulated. So a problem in Rome is a problem in Corinth, is a problem in Ephesus, is a problem in Galatia. He's just addressing specific issues to this. Okay, this church, you have this problem, but you all need to keep this in mind. It's like, so it's not, it's to an audience, or for an audience, but not to an audience. So it's like, a problem. It's like, it's sort of the argument that you hear about, like, did they steal the law when they wrote Torah from Egypt and Babylon and whatever? Well, a stolen ox is a stolen ox is a stolen ox, no matter where it is. It's the same problem. You just, it doesn't, that's the part that quibbling about doesn't really matter. The part that matters is, are you, as those who are pulled out as the light of Christ, embarrassing Christ and yourselves by ruining the gospel, by ruining your unity? That's, I think, all the way around, because all these letters are going to circulate, and he knew it. That's what matters. Okay, you get this letter, focus on this. You get this letter, those of you who are struggling with this, focus on this. And it's targeted toward the issue that's going to circulate through all the churches, not necessarily location dependent. I think it's issue dependent that circulates all the way around.
Our friend Jamie is calling us all out. He says that's because Romans 13 came and he says, keep the 10 commandments. He did not actually list anything in the first table and didn't list everything in the second table either in chapter 13. So I'm not sure about that. As far as the Sabbath wasn't changed to Sunday, Jesus' arrest. Well, the Sabbath actually was changed to Sunday, as far as like later tradition goes, because we know that even as early as the first century, people were worshiping on the first day of the week because of the resurrection Sunday. Yeah, I don't know about that, and I don't know that Paul would care. There's a principle of the Sabbath, and Paul doesn't seem to care what day it is, but I agree with you that Jesus is our Sabbath rest. That's he says that in the Gospels. He will give us rest. There's a syllogism in verses 7 through 9 that Paul sets up, which is why I think he broadens out the eating and drinking and the various days that you think are holy, because the syllogism goes, for not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord, or if we die, we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. And it is to this end that Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the living, or the dead, and of the living. Interesting fun fact here is the reference to Christ died and lived again reverses a lot of expectations, because usually with the Caesars, their biographies are constructed that he lived and then he died. And Paul's kind of reversing. Christ died and then he lived again, and so that he's living now. He's the Lord of both the dead and the living, which means even the dead are not beyond his rule and his reign. And so in life or death, we all belong to the Lord. And that kind of cements his argument about why you should not judge those for certain days or hold in contempt others who don't eat meat and all of this stuff, because it goes back to the master will help you stand. And then he furthers that line, appealing to the very gospel of the death and resurrection of Christ is what God is Lord over. So all of these other matters fall within that. If life and death fall within that, that seems to be his argument. Some people try to make more out of this Lord of both the dead and of the living, to weave in either on the extreme end a universalism that because he later goes on to say from Isaiah 43, every knee will bow, every tongue will give praise to God. He's like, well, he's the Lord of the dead, and they're all going to give praise too. So at least, if not a hypothetical universalism, even a post, and they run certain texts in Second Peter they get wrong. But I mean that there are people who try to argue universalism from this text. So I wanted to shout them out and say that's not what's going on here.
Right.
All Paul's argument is that because Christ has died and resurrected, both life and death are within his lordship, which he will sort out at Judgment Day for the dead, because everyone's going to give an account at the judgment seat of God. But I don't think that there's any hope here for either universalism or post-mortem evangelism. I know a lot of people have hope for that, though. But I just don't see it.
Yeah, I don't see it either. But I also think the reason they have or want to have hope in that is, everybody likes second chances. And if I don't get it right here, hopefully I can get it right after here. Unfortunately, that's just not the way it works. And I think obviously, I'm sure you guys have talked about, there's a beautiful progression in Paul's writing in Romans. And obviously you covered chapter 10 already. So he's identified, no, this is the way to be saved. This is why you need to be saved, the whole Romans road thing. And now that you understand those things, let's talk about the kind of nuance that's embedded in the life of the believer and how to do that well, so that we can maintain, as she was saying, that Amber was saying, that we can maintain that unity that Jesus prayed for in John 17.
Well, there is the issue like the post-mortem evangelism, some people say, when Jesus went to go preach to the spirits in prison, I think they misunderstand that. I understand that text as a victory lap to the evildoers, but I know the question is pertinent for a lot of people with regard to the unevangelized, or what about everyone who was not evangelized prior to the coming of Christ, before Christ's incarnation? What about the pagan nations that the Jews are supposed to be a light to? And so I understand why people lean that way. I'm not convinced by the readings of those texts, but I don't actually exclude the possibility of the unevangelized. I think I like what William Lane Craig says. People are judged on the basis of the revelation they had, not revelation they didn't have. But even there, I don't know how much hope I would have in success of that, because most people love their sin. So I don't know, but I understand the concern there. But I just don't see universalism or even post-mortem evangelism convincing.
Yeah.
Maybe, but I give it like a 3% chance of being. I'm not gonna say no because I don't know what God does, but I only give because you get weird stuff, man. Paul talks about the baptism of the dead. What was that about? No commentary knows what that was about. So who knows? But I'm just saying,
I think that's a lack of our ability to grasp the totality of what the sovereignty of God is capable of. Sometimes I think God has the ability to declare holy that which is not holy at his discretion without any of the bells and whistles anywhere in scripture. And he does with Isaiah, he does with the burning bush. God can just point and go, thou art holy, and save who he's going to save and save who he's not. That's not something that's ours to say. I think we discount and shortchange sometimes the discretionary sovereignty of God to be able to make those decisions beyond.
Careful, you're going to make the Calvinist amen you.
I have to say that some of my Reformed brothers and sisters there have a better understanding of sovereignty than a lot of ones who aren't. Yeah. That's all I'll say about that. Because the Old Testament is pretty clear about God's sovereignty. And I think we miss it sometimes.
I agree with that because I don't concede the word to Calvinism.
Right.
Right.
So verse 10 through 12, but as for, he goes back to his rhetorical device, but as for you, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or you as well, why do you regard your brother or sister with contempt? For we will all appear before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, there's an introductory formula, and he conflates the oath of Isaiah 49 something or other. I have it on my PowerPoint.
45:23.
45:23.
Well, that's 45:23 is kind of where he's citing, but he conflates that oath formula from 49:18 because as I live, says the Lord, is from 49:18. But yeah, 45:23 is the bulk of this text. To me, every knee will bow and every tongue will give praise to God. That's the bulk of it's from 45:23, like you said. So that's kind of his scriptural proof text for the fact that we will all appear for the judgment seat of Christ. And what's interesting about this reminder is he uses the word judge a lot throughout this entire section, but then he hammers home this point about Christ's lordship with, reminding believers that they're going to appear before the judgment seat of Christ so then his concluding remark is we're all going to give an account to God over these kinds of things.
Right.
Now, Paul does like to talk about final judgment. He introduced this idea in chapter 2. He talks about it in 1 Corinthians and other letters as well. But he loves to remind the church about this. And he's reminding the church about this in issues that we shouldn't be fighting over. That's, the people, he says nothing here about rewards. So you have to import that from other scriptures. This sounds scary to me.
I was going to say the same thing.
This sounds scary.
Well, and I think we need to go back again to the Old Testament context, because what Torah and what judgment was supposed to do was to pull those out, to cause them to change direction so that they could be brought back in. Justice, and the majority of justice in the Old Testament, is restorative. It's redemptive.
Mm-hmm.
It was not meant to be punitive primarily. Only when every attempt at redemption finally ran out and there was no other choice left but to permanently throw them out. So this is not, everybody loves to pull the imagery of the courtroom and stuff out of Isaiah and say, this is the absolute judgment of God. It is punitive. And then we end up in this whole legal system, meritorious nonsense. That's not the bulk of the Old Testament. The bulk of the Old Testament is restorative justice. It is redemption. That is justice in the Old Testament.
Yeah, but I agree, but there is punitive involved, and I mean, this is what I find interesting. Isaiah 45, verse 7 is always a fun one. The one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating disaster. I'm the Lord who does all these things. I mean, there's happiness and sunshine for you, but this isn't the context of King of Cyrus, which is interesting because this is God's use of the Gentile people, and that's plus he's already kind of echoed this language later on in the chapter back in Romans 9 about the potter and the clay, very humbling, punitive or restorative. Either way, it's very humbling. It's it's a reminder of whatever y'all are arguing about. It kind of pales in the light of the judgment that's going to befall each and every one of us to give an account for all of that. And we act like, well, I mean, I'm saved, so I'm going to get into heaven. So judgment's not going to be a big deal. It's like we gloss through that because, I believe in Jesus, so it'll be fine. Well, it may not be fine.
I agree. And I think it's humbling in the sense of, whenever it's just like the parable Jesus taught about, the guy who was trying to get his debt removed and then got it removed and then wouldn't remove the other person's debt who owed him. It's easy. I guess this verse is humbling and a reminder, and it is scary because it's saying that even as you judge this other person, this other brother or sister, don't forget the real judge is coming to judge you. Yeah. And so make sure you really want to hone in on this particular judgment you're speaking about this person. And if you feel like you still should, okay, then that's fine. But just do so with caution and do so with the recognition that the real judgment is coming for you and for all of us. But I think one more thing in verse, at the beginning of verse 10, it says, but why do you judge? So I think that's the best way to frame how to have hopefully better wisdom in this situation, because if somebody really believes X out alcohol, never, not in any situation, why do you believe that? And if they're going to be honest with themselves, they'll have to get to the conclusion of why they really believe that. And if it's not specifically grounded in scripture, then you have to admit, this is just how I feel about this thing. And I think that's an important question for all of us to ask before we judge is why? Why do I really feel? Is it because sometimes because of something I've done in the past or something I struggled with in the past, I look down, like you said, Jonathan, about I'm the weaker brother in that situation. I'm looking down on all of you because I can't do it anymore.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Like I'm not allowed to do that anymore in my own convictions. And that's the why. The why is not Jesus. And so if the why is not Jesus, it's you. And it doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means you have to recognize and be honest about that's your why. It's not because Jesus said thou shalt not. It's because you said thou shalt not.
Right. And that's kind of one of the things that comes with next week's passage is about the better way of dealing with this as matter of conscience as opposed to matter of judgment or even contempt. Because, I mean, and it's easy to think of examples of judging other believers for certain things that they have liberty for. The flip side of that is also having contempt, and I think I'm easier on the falling prey to having contempt for certain Christians that I consider pharisaical. And one of the reasons why is some of the people I think are coming from, that's part of the problem, is that some of the people that may look down on me for certain liberties that I have, I actually believe they are coming from a good place where they want what's best for me, and they find out I engage in, whatever glass of whiskey or something. And that I have less contempt for than someone that I think ought to know better. You've been a Christian as long as I have, but you just think that all alcohol is of the devil, and you want to judge me for it, and then try to say, well, I heard Pritchett does this on a podcast, so you should listen to him because alcohol is, he's probably, if he drinks once a month, he's lying. He's a drunk, right? That's kind of they say you just want to justify you drink in moderation. People want to. I've had that argument because I was a Southern Baptist for decades, so I've had those arguments, and it's easy to have contempt for them because they're the kind of people that say, don't let them judge you for what you think is acceptable, And so that's I don't think that person would even be remotely tempted to stumble if we were out to dinner and I ordered a beer. He's never going to stumble with wine because he thinks I'm evil for it.
Right.
And that's the perpetual weaker brother syndrome that I'm talking about, that people want to be professional weaker brethren so that they can curb everyone's liberty.
I mean, there's entire YouTube channels dedicated to being the weaker brother on whatever issue you want to name.
Yeah.
I think the whole point is you don't want to judge yourself right out of grace. I think that's the whole point.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's Matthew 7. I mean, it's like the second you fail to live up to your own standard, people are going to come after you because that was your canon. That was your measure.
Yep.
And they're going to come after you. And that makes Paul, persecuted. I mean, he puts out like, I was the worst person ever. So it's hard to say, once you've done as many bad things as Paul has, you put it all out there. It's like, well, what are you going to, how are you going to get on to Paul about something minor? It's like, so maybe I should put all my liberties out there. I have a very, very boring life. I think the worst thing I did was, I think my premium hand rolled cigar and whiskey habit that's every now and then, because I enjoy it. It's fun. You don't inhale cigars, they're for flavor. But yeah, I mean, I have such a low tolerance that I have to actually not overdo it. But like, I'm not going to give that up because I have no reason to. But I know somebody out there disapproves, right?
Yeah.
But I also know that I could probably look hard enough and find something that I disapprove of them. Like, for example, my wife and I are like penny pinchers. And it's easy for me to accuse Braxton of not only watching shows he shouldn't, but also you are a poor steward if you buy a video game. I don't care how much disposable income you have. That's a waste of money. So I have a lot of little things that I can think of that bother me about other Christians. It's like, really, how do you have time to play video games? Why are you spending money on that? Why do you have 6 different streaming services? But I can find all kinds of things money wise to pick on people about that under the idea of stewardship. You're being a poor steward, right? I used to blow all kinds of money, for years on the dumbest stuff. I didn't need more musical instruments, but I used to always deck out my studio. I'd need a new rack module that had the latest sounds on it and all this stuff, because I used to produce tracks and things like that. And I would always blow money on that. I always blow money on CDs. There were these little compact discs you could put in the car, kids. And I would DJ, so I'd have just endless, these big folders of, I blew all kinds of money.
Yeah.
But, so I could find, my temptation is to be weak on other people who have hobbies. It's like your hobby should be books and cigars. What do you mean you watch TV? But, I mean, so I'm not saying. My point is I can find ways to either hold people in contempt or be the judge. I can be weaker on this and stronger on that. So there's my confession.
Amen. You're absolved.
We'll see on Judgment Day.
Right.
So I'm still being sanctified, everybody. Part of the problem having a podcast is you say what you think just to there, and you're like, wow, he's probably a jerk. He's probably thinking horrible thing. I bought McDonald's. He's probably thinking I'm eating bland chicken and broccoli and rice, which you can actually buy chicken, broccoli, and rice for cheaper than a McDonald's combo meal. I noticed that here recently.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Golly, fast food is expensive and it's gross.
Yeah, it makes no sense anymore. It's more expensive and it's worse for you.
Yes. You can, for all of you here's another judgmental thing. I know not everyone has a backyard because not everyone gets to live, and some people live in apartments, or you're like Braxton and you chose to live in a condo so that you didn't have to mow grass or whatever. But if you have a backyard, I'm going to be like, why are you watching Netflix when you could plant a garden in your backyard, and grow your own vegetables? So I could pick on people all day long about how I have found the key to how everyone should live, and then let me tell you how to do it. And it's hard because we have a tendency to either be judgmental or content. And so Paul's right to call us out. And he's so non-specific about holy days, something non-specific. You eat everything or you just eat green stuff. And he's like, I like that strategy because you can always find that he's calling you out too,
Yeah.
And if you don't think he is, be Christian for a little bit while longer and you'll discover all kinds of horrible things about you.
True story.
Yeah. But so that's verses 1 through 12. Amber, any closing thoughts from you before we get into the practical stuff?
I think that we always just need to keep that the message of the gospel through unity is the most important thing to Paul. And so when we're reading Paul's writings and thinking about how do I be a part of the community that I'm in, am I the one running around causing drama, making everybody look bad and making the gospel a bad message? Or am I part of the solution by showing grace, by not judging everybody else, except for when it disrupts or interrupts or corrupts the gospel or breaks the unity? Other than that, I should mind my own business.
That's something Paul says in, what is it, in 1 Thessalonians 4? Something like, mind your own business. Where is that? I mean, that's a good thing.
He says in 1 Corinthians 4, I believe, he says, I don't even judge myself.
Right.
It's to the Lord to judge. So yeah, I would echo what Amber said. My thought would be, live your personal convictions. Don't preach your personal convictions.
But would you preach that? See, that's why I'm glad I have a pastor on here, because one of the things I wanted to ask you is, you're preaching on this text. What are you preaching when you preach on this text? Because are you preaching to divide people into categories, or more like you're all going to fall into one or the other? How would you preach this text?
Exactly like that. Exactly, basically like we did tonight, and same thing with the end of Romans 1 when he names 23 sins in one breath, and 24 if you count a few verses before that. Yeah. And I always tell people, like, you're in here somewhere, find your sin, and it's not even an exhaustive list. So there is no person obviously without sin or fault or need to grow, but some of those things are sin issues and some of those are personal convictions. And so I would say, kind of just what you said, that all of us are included in this passage. Either you eat all things, and that can go another way too. Sometimes we eat too many of all things, right? So, there's that. And then there's those who, for their own conviction, want to just be vegan or vegetarian or whatever the case is. That's fine too. But to both groups, the message is still the same, that we are united or should be, and we're united around one central message, which is the gospel. And as long as we remember that, I won't say everything goes. I'll just say we can discuss in a healthy way our personal convictions, and we might move the needle forward or backwards for someone else, or they may do that for us, but we're going to see each other in heaven.
Yeah, that's kind of where I would go too. I would say that one of the things that Christians get bagged on by non-Christians just from an apologetics thing is, how come y'all don't agree on all of this stuff? Part of it, yeah. But I think that that's a feature of Christianity rather than a bug.
Yeah.
Because the challenge before us is the unity in the gospel. And it is to mortify sin on an individual level, but it's also to hold each other accountable so that others don't fall into sin.
Right.
And so I actually don't have a problem with the fact that we have a variety of different views. And I know Catholics like to say, oh, yeah, 50,000 denominations. Yeah, but, Catholicism, the dirty little secret they don't tell you is that they have 50,000 different opinions within Catholics, one parish to the next, and within a parish, you might as well be different denominations. And you've got various, it's like, and they've got their liberal wing too. They're
and with Islam.
Yeah, Islam too. They're all like that. So it's like being Protestant. It's not really the end all be all, because you can find various opinions in all kinds of traditions. But again, I think as long as you unite around the death and resurrection of Jesus and recognize his lordship and the fact that we're all going to end up being judged by him, and hopefully because he is our Lord, that you will survive that judgment. But make sure you're growing in sanctification, because that's the telltale sign that you will survive that judgment. Because it's a good thing to remind Christians, I use that as the community of believers, the church, there may be not converted or on their way out people, apostates that are future apostates in the group, or never were saved people in the group as well, because it's the community of Christ, and in that you can't count on everyone being a believer. I've known people who went to church for years that got saved, after being in church for 15 years, and one day the Spirit spoke to. So the judgment thing, you can have assurance that you'll survive it, but it's always good to be reminded that it's coming for you too, because you have to give it an account. And just because you might escape judgment day as if by fire for some people, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians, be careful. Take stock in what you're doing. And I have to remind myself these things,
Yep, me too. Yeah.
All right. Well, Relentless Pursuit of Purpose, what is coming up on your channel, since you haven't been doing anything lately?
Yeah. So I am working on, I'll probably do some tonight. There was an article I read on Christian Gnosticism, which is an oxymoronic term, which is essentially what I'm going to outline in the video. So that's coming up soon.
But you know what the good thing is? If people are watching this and have not subscribed to your channel yet and are going to go do it, open up another window and your whatever, go subscribe to your channel, is that you have a back catalog of videos they've never seen.
True.
And I don't know why this is. If you subscribe to a new channel, like if you're watching from When Deep Calls Deep, if you're watching from Amber's channel and you like Trinity Radio, we have so many other videos. You don't have to wait for the next new one. Heck, all our best days are behind us. Those videos are we've been around since 2017. Our back catalog's better than our current catalog. So go watch that.
Check out some old videos on my channel, please.
That's right, because they're probably better than what I'm doing these days. Amber, what do you got coming up?
Oh boy. So tomorrow, part 2 of our Torah series, we're going to talk about the Pentateuch, how to read it, break it down, kind of talk about what's in there, and give people a roadmap through it. And then that's got, I think that's part 2. So we're going through part 5, which going to be, I'm so excited about this series. I've been planning this and working on this one for a long time. So this is like one of my favorite things. And then Friday, Leighton Flowers is coming, and Leighton Flowers and Nick and I are going to talk about how to reading the Old Testament in Tanakh order and why that matters and why it's important. Because I gave him homework dare when I met him at ETS to do it that way. So he's going to come back and report on how that went.
You're going to give Leighton Flowers to talk about something besides Calvinism? Are you serious? I heard he never does that, ever.
Never. One
Never
string
does
banjo is going to add a second string to his
there we
banjo
go.
on my channel. So,
Leighton
yeah,
Flowers, Old Testament guru. Yeah, I don't think that.
it's going to be fun. And then we've got some stuff coming up on Faith Unaltered with the Ecclesia project is kicking it back up again. We got some interviews coming up in the next couple weeks. And I think that's it. I'm not sure.
I'm supposed to do one of those interviews. I know.
Yes, you
Alex
are.
is better than me because he's actually a pastor.
Yes, but you're working at a seminary that's supposed to be training pastors.
No, you can't.
So that's right. That's right.
It's just a true story with me. I was a pastor for 10 months and got fired. It's so true. But I'm the expert, right? I'm going to teach you everything. Here's how to. No, seriously. No. All right. So when Deep Calls Deep and Relentless Pursuit of Purpose, go subscribe to those channels and subscribe to Trinity Radio if you haven't. And next time we'll be doing the rest of Romans chapter 14, hopefully next week, but you know how we are. And with that, we'll see you next time. God bless everybody.
All right.